Those of you already in London maybe recognize this picture. It's the Bloomsbury Farmers Market. Every Thursday around lunchtime or so, a lot of stalls set up right next to UCL in Bloomsbury. And they offer lots of different food options, Thai food, Indian. My personal favorite is the Italian pasta place. It's really delicious. I would very much recommend it. But the reason I'm telling you about the farmers market is not the delicious food. It's what is happening with the prices. And that is quite interesting. So how is the Italian pasta place able to charge £6.50, which is not cheap, for a smallish bowl of pasta? And for that, we need a model of supply and demand. Now, if you have followed along so far, you should have a pretty good grasp of conditions under which markets emerge spontaneously, differences in preferences, differences in endowments, and so forth. You also should have a pretty good grasp of sort of the core theoretical ingredients, information and incentives that go into a functioning market. And you have, I hope, a good understanding of the concept of Pareto efficiency. So now you're ready. Ready for what? Well, ready for the introduction of one of the workhorse models of modern economics, the interplay of supply and demand in a competitive market leading to equilibrium. The core ingredients for our workhorse model of competitive markets are supply and demand curves. Now, what is a demand curve? What is a supply curve? Well, a demand curve basically tells us for a given price how much of a good is an individual willing to buy. So if you think about coffees at the farmers market, if the price of a coffee is £1, how many coffees are you going to buy over the month? I don't know, many maybe. If the price of coffee goes up to £3, are you going to buy fewer coffees? Probably. And what if the price of coffee was £10? Would you buy the same amount of coffees? Some of you maybe, but most of us would reduce the amount of coffee we consume, or we would bring our own coffee, of course. So people respond to incentives, like we said in the beginning, and in this case, people respond to the price of a good. So if goods are cheaper, we will demand more of them. If goods are more expensive, we will demand less of them. Now, individually, that can look quite funny. Maybe I stop buying coffee altogether if it is too expensive. But we can add up all our individual demand curves into what is called a market demand curve. And the market demand curve adds up all these individual demand curves of all the people in the market and gives us the total quantity individuals in the economy are willing to purchase at each given price. Okay, and if we put quantity on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis, then the demand curve is downward sloping. As the price increases, demand falls. So let's look at this in an example. Right, so here we have on the x-axis the quantity of coffee demanded, and on the y-axis we have the price of coffee. And we've chosen a slightly more realistic sort of range than the £10 I suggested earlier. I'm not sure how many coffees could be sold at the price of £10 at the moment. Right, and I said that the demand curve is downward sloping because if we think about if the price of coffee is £3, maybe it's too high. Price of an espresso, say. So few people are willing to buy it. But if the price falls a bit, say £2.50, already more people are willing to buy an espresso after lunch at the farmers market. And if the price falls to £2, even more people are willing to buy a nice little espresso after lunch. And if the price falls more to say £1.50 or £1 or 50p, then even more people buy espresso, okay? Because they can afford it, because their willingness to pay for an espresso is higher than the market price, okay? So we get this nice curve, and I said it is downward sloping because as the price falls, the quantity of coffees demanded increases. Or in other words, if the price increases, the quantity demanded falls. So this is the market demand curve for espressos at the farmers market. Okay. Now, I've already introduced the term willingness to pay. What is willingness to pay? Willingness to pay is the maximum amount that a buyer will pay for a good. It measures how much you value the good or service. So, if you're really tired after a nice lunch of Italian pasta, maybe you're willing to pay quite a bit for an espresso, especially if you have no other way to get a coffee. So maybe you're willing to pay £3 for an espresso. But for other people, maybe they are less addicted to caffeine than I am, or they have less money and they are less willing to pay, only willing to pay less for an espresso. So willingness to pay gives us, for each individual, the amount they are willing to pay for a good. Now, this allows us to think about a somewhat theoretical construct, but it's really, really helpful when we think about efficiency, and that is the concept of consumer surplus. Now, consumer surplus is essentially all our willingness to pay levels integrated compared with the price. So consumer surplus is the buyer's willingness to pay for a good minus the amount the buyer actually pays for it. So it measures the benefit to each of us, the benefit that buyers receive from the good as they perceive it. So if I'm really tired, I would be willing to pay, say, £3 for the espresso. But thankfully, the market price is only £1.50. What does that mean? Well, in a way, I have gained £1.50 because I would have been willing to pay much more for the espresso, but it is much cheaper than my willingness to pay. Okay, and that is a surplus for me. It's a gain for me, if you want. And if we aggregate all these individual gains, we arrive at the concept of consumer surplus, and it measures the total amount that people gain from the comparison between what they would be willing to pay for a good and the market price. So we can use the demand curve to measure consumer surplus. So let's look at an example. So here we have, again, our price and quantity. We have our demand curve, same as before. And let's say the market price is P1, okay? Then the quantity demanded is going to be Q1. And basically this triangle ABC gives us the consumer surplus. Why? Because every individual consumer that is, let me turn on the laser pointer here. Every individual consumer here benefits from this relatively low price. So there's people here, like me, who have eaten the big Italian meal and are very tired, who need to buy an espresso, okay? And I would be willing to pay £3 for the espresso. But the price is only this level, P1, £1, okay? That means I gain, say, £2. And then there are lots of other people whose willingness to pay is higher than the price of espresso. So they're all buying espressos and they're really happy about it. And then we get to these people here. So there are some people for whom the willingness to pay is just above the market price for espresso. And they just about buy the espresso. And then on the other side of the, then we have one person maybe here, or very few people here, who are just about indifferent. They can maybe buy the espresso or maybe don't buy the espresso. They're indifferent given the price. And then we have people who are priced out. So if the price was lower, these people would buy it too. But they can't afford it or don't want it as much as me in this case. Okay. So for a given price, we can measure the total gain to us as consumers with this triangle, the difference between the demand curve and the actual market price. Now, what happens if the price changes? Well, we have our price level here, P1, quantity demanded Q1, and we had our initial consumer surplus. But what happens if the price of espresso falls? Maybe there's another espresso stall, Italian coffee stall that sets up that offers cut price espressos, or there's a shock to coffee prices, and there was a really good harvest, and lots of coffee is available, so the price of coffee has fallen. So what happens then? We go from P1 to a new lower price P2, and what happens to and that means our quantity demanded increases. Yeah? So more additional people are choosing to buy coffee now. Yeah? And of course, we end up with additional consumer surplus to these people that were already buying the coffee. So I benefit because I would have been willing to pay, say, £3 for my espresso, but now I pay even less for the espresso, so that's good for me. And we have additional consumers, new consumers who weren't able to buy a coffee before, but are now that there's a lower price. And these people benefit as well. And there's still, of course, some people who don't buy it at this price. Okay. Now, we of course need the counterpart. So we've introduced a market demand curve, and we've introduced the important concept of consumer surplus. So we have to look at the other side of the market. We have to look at supply. So there are buyers for espresso, but who's going to make the espressos? Who's going to sell the espressos at the farmer's market? Well, for this, we need the supply curve. So we can think about the supply curve of an individual firm, which gives us the amount of espresso, in this case, the firm or the coffee stand is willing to supply at each price. So for a given price, are you going to set up your stall, and how many coffees are you willing to sell? And the market supply curve adds up the supply curves of all these firms and gives the total quantity that firms in the economy are willing to supply at each price. And this is, of course, if we have quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis, this is, of course, upward sloping. The higher the price, the more people want to set up a coffee stall. So what does it look like? Well, same as before, but we look at the supply curve now. So if the price of espresso is £1, we have some people supplying espresso. If the price is £1.50, we have more people willing to set up a coffee stand, and so forth and so forth. Okay, so supply curves are upward sloping. The higher the price, the more lucrative it is, the more players are willing to enter the market, the more people are willing to set up an espresso stand. So if the price increases, the quantity of coffees supplied increases as well. Now we're ready to introduce the mirror image of the consumer surplus, and that is producer surplus. Now, producer surplus is the amount a seller is paid for the good, given the market price, minus the seller's cost. So how much does it cost me to make an espresso, to set up a stand and sell 1 unit of espresso? And how much do I get for it, given the market price? So it's the same as the consumer surplus, but in reverse. It measures the benefit to the sellers, to the producers participating in the market. And just as the consumer surplus is based on the demand curve, of course, producer surplus is related to the supply curve. And we can see this nicely here. So we have our price quantity diagram, and we have our supply curve, upward sloping. The higher the price, the more people are willing to set up espresso stands. And for a given price, P1, we have a given quantity supplied, Q1. Now, this area, ABC, gives us the producer surplus. There are, if you think about this as a big market, there are some people here for whom producing espresso is really cheap. So, for example, the little stand at the farmer's market doesn't have many fixed costs because he doesn't rent a place. So he has just a little stand that he can put in various different places. So he only has to buy the espresso and the water and these kind of things, and it's his own time. So he can produce espresso quite cheaply, and he has a big sort of surplus, a big profit from selling an additional unit of coffee. But then there are other producers for whom this is not so good. Maybe they're not very good at making espresso, or they have other costs like rent or machinery that they have to invest in. so who are not able to produce espresso at this market price. So what happens if the price increases? Well, if we go from P1 to P2, an increase in price, more producers are willing to supply at this price. So, for example, there's an increase in demand. More people want to drink espresso, or more students are in the area. Then it suddenly becomes profitable for more potential producers to set up espresso stands. And what happens to the producer surplus? Well, we have some people, like the guy with the little coffee stand that was producing espresso already at this low level. He is really happy because he makes an even bigger profit. So the market price is much higher than his cost. And then we have these people who just about broke even, maybe because of rent or whatever it is. They are happy now as well because they can sell at a price that is much higher than their cost. And we have new entrants to the market. So new people decide to set up a coffee stand because it is so profitable. So we have additional producer surplus to initial producers, and then we have producer surplus to new producers. So these guys here are setting up coffee stands because the price is so high that they can charge, that it's good for them, profitable for them to do this as well. And maybe if the price of espresso was even higher, even more producers would choose to enter the market. Maybe if the price of espresso was, I don't know, £10 in espresso, maybe I would buy a coffee machine and a little stand and set up an espresso stand myself, and stop the lecturing, right? Because it's so profitable. So people change their behavior in response to the market price. So now we have all the ingredients together. We have demand curves, we have supply curves, we have consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now, what happens if we put these things together? Well, this is what we call the concept of market equilibrium. And equilibrium occurs at the point, at the price and quantity where market demand equals market supply. So where exactly as many coffees get produced as there are buyers for it. Now, what were to happen if the price was above the equilibrium level? So if for some reason producers would try to charge more than the market price, well, there would be a surplus or excess supply. So some of the quantity supplied wouldn't be sold. Some people wouldn't buy all these espressos available in a way. And if the price was below the equilibrium level, then there would be a shortage. So some people wouldn't be able to get an espresso, or we would get strange secondary markets like long queues, people waiting for to get their espresso, paying with time for the espresso. So shortage. So let's look what it looks like in a diagram. So what does the equilibrium result look like in a market? Well, we have our supply curve. The higher the price of coffee, the more people are willing to set up espresso stands. And we have our demand curve. So the lower the price of coffee, the more coffee is going to be sold, the more people are going to be willing to buy coffee. And taken together, we get to a point where market supply meets market demand. And this is, of course, the concept that you've heard before. And in this example, that's set at £2 for the espresso, for example. There are exactly as many people willing to pay £2 as there are suppliers willing to produce espressos, to make espressos for people. And this is what we call the market equilibrium, or equilibrium quantity. So equilibrium quantity is 7 espressos per month, maybe, and the equilibrium price, or £2. £2 we have here. Now, what happens if markets are not in equilibrium? Well, if there was an excess supply or surplus, we would end up with a supply, a quantity that is much bigger than the quantity demanded at £2.50. So if for some reason the price of espresso was set at 250, there would be lots of potential suppliers. Lots of people would be willing to sell espressos at this price, but there wouldn't be any consumers. Nobody would, or not that many people would demand to drink espresso. So there would be people trying to sell espressos and nobody is buying them. So the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. And that's what we call a surplus. Now, when that is the case, basically suppliers will have to lower the price to increase sales, or they have to exit the market. Suppliers will have to lower the price to increase sales and move towards equilibrium. They will have sales, for example, or they will have specials, these kind of things. Or there will be some producers who can't keep up because they don't simply sell enough espressos. Okay, and that leads to a reduction of the price towards equilibrium. So it is a steady state in the sense that if you deviate from the equilibrium price at quantity by setting the price too high, the supply is not going to be met with sufficient demand, and it will be self-correcting, so it will fall back towards the equilibrium level. Now, what happens if there's excess demand, if there's a shortage? Well, so we have our equilibrium price and quantity here, and what if the price of coffee was lower for some reason? Let's say there's a coffee price cap set up by the government. Not very realistic, but it could be. Well, what would happen is that there would be fewer suppliers, only 4 producers would be willing, only 4 espressos per month or whatever would be sold at this price. So fewer producers willing to offer espresso, but lots of demand. Lots of people want to buy the cheap £1.50 espressos. So what happens then? Well, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, and there's a shortage. So what happens then? Well, either there has to be some rationing mechanism, so only the first few people get an espresso, or we have to institute a lottery, or there's a waiting list where you apply and maybe you get an espresso one day. But the more natural response, of course, is that suppliers will raise the price, so they will be able to charge a little bit more because there are so many buyers chasing the goods at this equilibrium, at this lower price level until we reach equilibrium. So suppliers will be able to increase the price up to the point where supply meets demand. So again, if the price is too low, there's a self-correcting sort of mechanism to fall back towards the equilibrium price. And now we can put all these things together. Now, consumer surplus and producer surplus basically let us answer the following question. Is the allocation that we get when supply and demand meet in any way desirable? And remember, consumer surplus was the value to buyers minus the amount actually paid. And remember, producer surplus was the amount received by the producers, by the sellers, minus the cost. So total surplus in the society, or in the coffee market in this case, is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, or in other words, the value to buyers minus the cost to the sellers. Does this sound familiar? Yes, of course, it's efficiency. Total surplus is basically a combination of consumer and producer surplus, and the price and quantity in a market, so the resource allocation given by a market that maximizes total surplus, is an efficient allocation of resources in society. So competitive markets are able to allocate the supply of goods to those buyers who value them most highly, as measured by their willingness to pay, because they're willing to buy it or not for a given price. It allocates the demand for the goods to the sellers who are best able to produce them, or who are able to produce them at least cost. And so in total, it produces the quantity of goods that exactly maximizes the sum of producer and consumer surplus. And this is what we can see graphically here. So we have our supply curve, we have our demand curve, and we have our equilibrium price and quantity. And we have a consumer surplus here and producer surplus below it. So this quantity, total surplus, consumer surplus plus producer surplus maximized, is what a competitive market gives, and it is an efficient allocation of resources. So in conclusion, if a market happens and it is competitive, perfectly competitive, there are many buyers and sellers, and some other assumptions that we will relax over the next weeks, and price is at the equilibrium, then we get to full efficiency. And Stiglitz in the book works through the details. So if you want to look at exchange efficiency, that's kind of what we looked at here, production efficiency and product mix efficiency. It can be really, really helpful, but it's not required for assessment. But basically, these tell us that for a given budget constraint and price, remember everyone is a price taker, no individual is able to influence the price of coffee. So just because I buy a lot of coffee doesn't mean that the price of coffee rises or falls. So for a given budget constraint and everyone being a price taker, individual consumption choices are going to be optimal. So people choose the combination of goods and services and leisure and work that maximize their utility. And the goods go to those consumers who value them most. Thinking about the treats example before, those who really want the Snickers do get the Snickers. Okay, and taken together with the same reasoning for production choices, so allocating the production to the producers who are best able to produce it, or who are able to produce it at the lowest cost, and the combination of these, we can show that competitive markets lead to Pareto efficient outcomes. And that's the big result for today's lecture. All right, I hope you've been able to follow along, and you are now convinced that markets, competitive markets, lead to a Pareto efficient allocation of resources. And that's great. So what we have now is a benchmark for performance. So we know what a perfect competitive market would look like and what kind of allocation it would result in if it were organized. And this is basically the yardstick against which we can compare other scenarios. And that's the realm of market failures. So the next few weeks we'll basically look at conditions where this beautiful result that we just saw, Pareto efficient allocation of resources, is broken. Markets have failed. And examples for this over the next few weeks include public goods. They include externalities, so pollution and climate change and big questions like that. Market power and monopoly and abuse of market power by companies, and imperfect information, so principal agent models, moral hazard and adverse selection. And those market failures, of course, are the core, or one of the core sort of motivations for public policy, for intervention into markets. If markets don't do what we just saw, then you have a good rationale for intervention. You should intervene in the market and do something about it and make it work. By regulation, by taxation, by fines, whatever mechanisms we choose. But there's one caveat. Now, market failures, of course, may warrant government intervention, but we're in a political science department. So we also are able to look at sort of government failure, what economists call government failure. So just because a market doesn't work as advertised and you think the government should do something about it, doesn't mean that the government does the right thing about it. Because government agents, politicians, are also self-interested agents that do things not necessarily for the greater good, but maybe for the good of their party or their own pocket. And that's what we call government failure. So we'll investigate market failures in the next few weeks. And we should always keep in mind that our solutions, even if they are beautiful and optimal solutions to the market failure in question, have to be compatible with the incentives of politicians as well.